Now, education policy as a topic has gained, or has had a renewed interest, especially since the time that the new education policy in India came out. So I think from an Indian perspective also, it's a very contemporary topic. And we have with us Professor Steve Robinson to talk about it. Now, before I introduce Professor Robinson, Poovi ma'am, would you like to formally welcome him?
Yes, thank you, Kushal and Dr. Steve Robinson, and I, on behalf of Institute of Law, Nirma University, wholeheartedly welcome you, sir. I mean, your talk last time when you visited on the elementary education and how the US was driving this elementary compulsory education, that was very amazing lessons to learn for India. In India, we also have a special act for compulsory and free elementary education, but we are still struggling with reference to the execution of these laws. So there are a lot of things to learn from the US experiences, and you have been the one who has been instrumental and played a very pivotal role. So it would be great to hear your views on education policy. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Steve, and over to you. We are eager to listen to your talk. Thank you.
Yes. So just a quick introduction before Professor Steve takes the dais. He has been a White House Special Assistant, White House Domestic Policy Counsel, Executive Office of the President. Professor Steve has also, from 2009 to 2013, he has served in the Executive Office of the President as a Special Assistant on the White House Domestic Policy Council, where he focused on kindergarten to 12th education policy issues. Dr. Robinson has previously served as a special advisor to Secretary of Education Ann Duncan, as a member of the Obama administration presidential transition team, and has advised on education policy development during the 2008 presidential campaign. He was also a legislative assistant in the office of Senator Barack Obama from 2005 to 18, where he was initially placed as an Albert Einstein Distinguished Education Fellow. We welcome you, Professor Steve, and over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Nandwani and Dean Pokhrial. So I'll share my screen and see if we can get this started. Okay. All right. One thing that was not mentioned in my biography, and I thank you for introducing me, is that I've also been a teacher. I was a teacher for many years. I have a Ph.D. in molecular biology. I taught at the university level, but I also taught at high school and middle school levels in the United States. So one of the things that I would like to first start with is kind of my beliefs about this, that education is good. Education is necessary, both for the individual and for society. That society should provide educational opportunities for youth, and government has a role, and access to education should be equitable. That is, it should be based on individual student needs. I think that those are kind of the three things that I believe about education. And I don't know that everyone in America believes all of those things, but progressives and Democrats, I think, would agree with all three of those. So I'm going to start with education is good. So we know that poverty and education are intertwined. They're very connected. So here's poverty rate in the United States by educational level. No high school diploma up to a college degree. Those without a high school diploma, about a quarter of those people live below the poverty line in the United States. As you gain education, you are more likely to be well off. Here's another graph showing basically the same thing. This is the rate of unemployment in the United States from over the past 20 or so years. People who have less than a high school diploma are much more likely to be unemployed. So education is really important for the economy, for individuals, for society. But in the United States, the Constitution does not provide for much of a federal role in education. In fact, it does not mention education at all. And the powers not delegated to the United States in Article 10 by the Constitution are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. So what that means is that in the United States, the the federal role in education has traditionally been relatively small. It's been left up to states and to school districts, and I'll talk about the division of responsibilities at those various levels. So here are kind of the major points I'm going to try to make today. American public schools are extremely varied, state to state and district to district. There is little federal role, but the federal government has two primary levers. One is money in the form of federal education funding. And although that's a fair amount of money, it seems in Washington, D.C. like we're giving away a lot of money. It's a very small proportion of the total cost of education. So money and then ensuring fairness or ensuring equity, generally through mandates that focus on ensuring equity in education. And just to be clear about the terms that we're using, here's a little example of the difference between equality and equity. If you were giving people bicycles, if you gave everybody the same bicycle, for some people that would be good, and for some people it would be insufficient. So really what you need to do is say, okay, if there's someone who has problems with mobility, you might need to get them a tricycle, recumbent. Someone who's very large might need a big bicycle. A child might need a small bicycle. So equity is saying that students who are the farthest behind, which is usually low-income students and students of color, that is Black and Hispanic students in the United States, require more resources to catch up, to succeed, and eventually close the achievement gap. That is the fact that they're often behind in education. So we need to think about how to provide things equitably. And although Dean Pokhariel said that America is a leader, I think that there's lots of challenges that we have just not solved and in many cases not addressed about equity. Okay. So what I'll discuss today is the role, this idea of federalism, the national government, state governments, and local governments. You know, state governments have a very important role in education and simply in government in the United States. You know, we're a federal government, right? Congress, the president, and federal courts and government agencies have a big role, but a lot of work that the government does is done by state officials and then by local officials. And that's especially true for public education. So I'll go back to this first point. American public schools are extremely varied, state to state and district to district. Here's a picture of all of the different districts in the United States. And what this shows is that the spending in districts varies a lot, district to district. So this color, this kind of blue-green, shows that they're spending way above the national average. The reddish colors show that they're spending way below the national average. So New York State, some parts of the state of Wyoming, some parts of California, a lot of the Northeast, spends a lot more money than the rest of the country. Here's a close-up of some of the states out west, showing that different districts, even within a state, there can be big variations. For example, in California, there are huge variations just across, here's San Francisco, across the Bay in Oakland. These are places where the education funding is relatively low at the local level, whereas across the Golden Gate Bridge up in this county, up in Marin County, there's a much higher level of education spending. So you can just go a few miles and see huge differences in terms of education because these spending programs and these education programs are run to some extent at the local level. And that has consequences. So here is a picture showing graduation rates. The graduation rates are much higher if the color is blue, much lower if the color is green, and you can see that there are many places where there's a high graduation rate, places in the deep south, and many places out west. Many of these places where Native Americans live have very low graduation rates in comparison to the rest of the country. And in addition, things such as test scores vary tremendously. Those places that have low graduation rates often have very low test scores. Those are correlated, right? So this shows the green areas are places where students test much above the national average, a couple of grade levels above the national average. That's very common in the Northeast, where education is very highly valued and pretty heavily funded. Students in the South are often very far behind grade level, very far below grade level. That's also true in much of the West, and especially where Native Americans live. So to understand this, I want to talk a little bit about the overall structure of elementary and secondary education in the United States. So elementary and secondary education span 12 academic years, grades. Students usually spend from 6 to 8 years in elementary education, then 4 to 6 years of high school or secondary education, and they're normally done with public education by age 17 or 18. And then hopefully they will graduate. All states require students to attend school. That's true everywhere. You have to attend school. It doesn't have to be a public school, but if you go to a public school, it's free. All public schools are tax supported, and all public schools are free to students. Now there's a variation in what that means. There are different kinds of schools, charter schools versus traditional public schools, magnet schools. Those have different meanings, but all of those public schools are free to those who attend, and everyone is expected to attend by law. So here's a diagram of the structure. And again, this varies. It's a little bit complicated because it varies depending upon the state laws and the local district decisions. So typical configuration is that students may go to kindergarten, but that's not true in every state. Some may go to nursery schools prior to kindergarten. So these are students up to age 5. Then they'll enter elementary school. Traditionally, they might go to an elementary school, then to a middle school, then to a high school. I attended public schools where I went to a elementary school until the 5th grade, then 6th, 7th, and 8th grade were in a middle school, and then I went to a 4-year public high school. But there are a number of different options for how this is done. And I think that this diagram, compared to my understanding of the national education proposal in India, looks very similar, right? That you have early education, then a couple of different levels up to high school. My understanding is this is the national education plan for 2020. So relatively similar in structure to what exists in the United States currently. The scale of education in the United States, there are approximately 50 million students in public schools in the United States. That's almost every young person in America, about 98%, right? There are about 3.5 million teachers in K-12, a total of about 130,000 schools, and the average cost per student is about $13,000. I said there were a number of different school districts. There's almost 14,000 different school districts. And as a result of that, there's a lot of patchiness, a lot of discontinuity, a lot of individual decisions that are being made at local levels across the United States. There's advantages and disadvantages to that, and we'll talk about those. All right, a little bit about the calendar and how students progress through. So in the United States, the school calendar is usually approximately 180 days. That is about half of the days of the year students are expected to be in school. Usually begins in late August, early September, and continues until June in most places. There's lots of discussion about extending the calendar, and some charter schools, which have more freedom, often have a longer school year. Charter schools are public schools that are somewhat different from other schools within a district. They run by a charter, that is an agreement between the school itself and the school district that allows them more flexibility in what they do in hiring, in school day, and length of the school year, and in curriculum. Most elementary school students are in the same classroom all day with one teacher. And that teacher teaches all subjects. So that can be true up, for me, it was true up through 5th grade. I had the same, every year I would have one teacher that I would have for all of my subjects. Secondary school day usually consists of 5 to 6 instructional periods with short breaks between those periods. And what happens there is the teachers stay in their classroom and the students move from room to room. Okay? So, for example, I was a high school science teacher when I taught in public schools. I taught biology, chemistry, and physics, different years. but I was always a science teacher. I never had the opportunity to teach history or math or English. The curriculum is often set at local, state or local levels. States generally set some broad curriculum guidelines. What is it that students are expected to do? What is it that students are expected to know? Within these guidelines, schools and even individual teachers generally get to determine what they teach and how they teach it and how quickly they teach it, the pace of instruction. So I generally had pretty loose guidelines about what I would teach in my biology class or my chemistry class. It was up to me. And that might be different from a biology teacher in the next room. They might teach their curriculum in a different way. They might teach different subjects. That really depends upon decisions that are made at the local and school level. And this shows that in high school, students may take very different courses. So kind of a standard curriculum is that a student will take 4 years of English, 3 years of social studies. So that would be history, world history, American history, maybe economics, 3 years of mathematics, 3 years of science, and maybe no foreign language whatsoever. Americans are very bad at foreign languages. A rigorous curriculum might be that they would take 4 years of English, 3 years of social studies, 4 years of math. Math every year is pretty important. 3 years of science, including specific sciences, and with those specific sciences usually being lab sciences, and 3 years of a foreign language, often 4 years. That's considered a more rigorous curriculum, and in general is looked upon more favorably by college admissions decisions. Now, promotion to the next grade, how do you go from grade to grade? It's usually based on a student's grades, what grades they earn in a particular year. Students are most likely to be retained during the early grades of elementary school. It's less likely that someone will be held behind or not progress from grade to grade in high school. And as a general rule, most students graduate from high school at the age of 17 or 18. So that's a pretty typical playbook for how students do. Now, there's a very interesting documentary that you may have seen called 2 Million Minutes. And what 2 Million Minutes is a documentary that compares education in China and India and the United States. And in this documentary, American students don't end up looking very good, I'll be honest with you. So this diagram may give you some idea. These students here sitting in class, paying attention, all dressed in an acceptable uniform. American students wearing whatever they want, chatting with each other, maybe not paying attention. The biggest challenge for a teacher is classroom management in America, in most schools or in many schools. And here's a student who says, it looks like the American student life is like almost a dream. It's like there's no studying and very light syllabus. They maybe study once in a while. So that, I think, is a view that some people share about what American schools are like. There's a lot of difference from room to room. There may be very big differences in classroom management styles and curriculum styles. Higher ed is different. Not everybody goes to college in the United States, and to some extent it's based upon your performance in high school. But there's a pretty broad range of what's possible in colleges. So I went to a 4-year undergraduate program, Princeton University. I then went on, I got a Ph.D. and did postdoctoral research. But a lot of students go to a 2-year community college, usually much more affordable. Some of those students might then transfer to a 4-year undergraduate program, right? Some go to career and technical institutions. And again, this is basically done on the basis of student and family choice and what's affordable, because college in the United States is very expensive and becoming increasingly expensive all the time. There are about 20 million students in American colleges. There are approximately almost 3,000 4-year colleges and universities. Most Americans in the United States, about 94%, have completed at least high school, but a much lower percentage, less than 40%, have completed 4 or more years of college. College education is not mandatory, and it's expensive. But there are great advantages to having a college degree. And unlike American public education at the K-12 level, which I think is in some ways mediocre compared to other systems, American universities are very highly ranked. Here's a list of the top 10 universities in the world by some ranking system, and of those top 10, 7 are in the United States. So American colleges are considered quite good. And I won't talk more about higher education because the federal role in higher education is really minimal other than providing funding. And that's basically funding by scholarships and grants to students to attend colleges of their choice. There's really very little other role. In K-12 education, I think what I want to ask is, the next question is, I said that the government has a role. Education is good and important. And it's important that we provide an equitable education. So the question I think we need to ask is, how is the United States performing in K-12? And to ask that question, let's look at how it's performing relative to other nations. So here are the results simplified for some international tests that show the percent of 15-year-old students, so these would be high school students in America, who meet what would be considered basic standards of proficiency in reading, in math, and in science. Okay? The United States, 68% of students are at a level that would be considered proficient in those 3 areas. So, that's about 2/3. In China, it's almost very close to 100%, 95%. Singapore, Estonia, Canada, a lot of countries, students do much better than American students on tests of international. But American parents, United States parents, think their students are all excellent. They're above grade level in English and math. In fact, that's not true. We kind of avoid the problem because we think our students are doing fine, our individual students. Everybody loves their kids and thinks they're doing great. Here's a slightly more detailed picture of mathematics in 4th grade, comparison by the TIMSS tests. Here's the United States right here, behind a number of countries: Singapore, Hong Kong, Korea, England, Northern Ireland, Lithuania, the Netherlands, Austria. Okay, it is ahead of a number of countries, but it's behind very many too, right? As I use the term mediocre. Now, one of the questions that we raised at the beginning was equity. How is it doing across the board? So here is a diagram that shows the results for those international tests, the TIMSS tests. These are tests of mathematics performance. And what this shows is, here are the scores for those that are performing near the top, the 90th percentile. Here are the scores for those that are performing near the bottom, the 10th percentile. There's a huge difference between these scores. There's a huge difference. 642 versus 385 in those scores in the most recent test, which is 2019. And to some extent, these differences have gotten greater over the years. They narrowed for a while, but they're pretty great. So there's a huge difference in terms of how students are performing. The question is that because of the educational system? Is it because of inequities in the system? So, kind of a complicated picture here, but what this shows is a number of different countries, right? Then here are their scores on the TIMSS tests, average scores, right? And then what this shows, the 90th, 10th percentile score gap is lower in all of these countries that have a downward pointing arrow than in the United States. So countries that score better than us, countries that score worse than us, almost all of them have less of a gap between those students in the 90th percentile and those that are in the 10th percentile. What that means, simply, is that America is excellent at having a huge gap between its best students and its most challenged and struggling students. Okay? Equity either is not existent or is not reflected in student outcomes. Again, all of these countries have a smaller gap than the United States in terms of the difference between their 90th percentile high-performing students and 10th percentile low-performing students. So in that sense, we're not doing very well. Now, who are those students in the 90th percentile and the 10th percentile? So again, looking at those international comparisons, what this is showing is test scores versus poverty levels. This is measured by what's called free and reduced price lunch. In America, if you're a student from a low-income family, you can get a free lunch at school, even if you get a bad education, all right? So if it's a high poverty school where 75% or more of the students are on free or reduced price lunch, the scores are much lower than in those schools where the students come from wealthier families. Again, this is a huge difference, very similar to that difference that was shown 2 slides ago between the 90th and the 10th percentile. That difference in student test performance correlates with differences in poverty levels of the schools that the students attend. This shows a similar graph. These are the test scores, but now this is broken down by race, right? White students, in general, score higher on the tests. Asian American students score even higher, right? But Black, Hispanic, and Native American students all score lower, right? These students are more likely to attend schools where most of the students are from real low-income families. So the question, are we getting better over time? Here are the results from another national test called the NAEP tests in mathematics, but English tests are similar. Over time, from 1990 to 2019, the scores have increased a little bit, from 213 in grade 4 up to 241. That's a significant increase. These are both significant increases over a long span of time, so we are getting a little bit better. And if we break that down and we look at different groups, white students over that same time span from 1973 to 2012, I guess it's a slightly different, longer time span, have basically stayed pretty much the same, 310 to 314. Black and Hispanic students have gotten a little bit better. So they've actually shown some progress. So that suggests that the system is working in some way to provide better results for those students who need it. Well, a question that's often asked is, are we getting our money's worth? All right? We're seeing maybe slight increases, slight improvements over time. How does that correlate to the cost for the cost? So over time, from 1971 to 2016, the cost of education per student has increased. This is the per pupil expenditure, gone up from about $5,000 in constant 2017, $18, up to over $12,000. We're spending a lot more money. And people say, oh, we're spending a lot more money, but the results aren't really that much better. And we expect that we will continue to spend more money into the future. This is a projection from the Census Bureau of what are the expected per pupil costs, up to $15,000 per year in the next, by the end of the decade. One of the things that that money has paid for is an increase in the number of teachers. We pay for more teachers, and the student to teacher ratio has gone down significantly from the 1960s to current days, and that's helped. People argue that it has to go down even more. But again, we still have this variation that we looked at before, variation in test scores by district. Again, Deep South, Far West, Native lands, in general, those students are much further behind. Students in the Northeast, more money is spent, more emphasis on education. In the upper Midwest and Wyoming and Colorado, a couple of states out west, do very well. All right, so why aren't we doing better? We're seeing some improvement. We're spending a lot more money and we're seeing some improvement. There's a lot of dissatisfaction with that. So what are the problems? What's holding us back? How do we account for these academic gaps? All right, complicated figure here. Here's the parents' socioeconomic status. Poorer families, more wealthy families. Okay? Students who are ahead of the average, 3 grades ahead of the average. Students who are behind the average. Again, you can see a clear correlation, clear relationship between familial poverty and student success. Poorer students tend to do less well. Students from wealthier families do much better. If we look at that and we ask, okay, we look at that same data set, but we now ask a little bit more about those families other than just poorer families, wealthier families. We see that students from white families tend to do much better. They're wealthier and their educational attainment is higher. Now there's some families down here that are from some students here who are from white families that are relatively poor, and that same correlation holds, right? Less wealth, less educational attainment. Hispanic families, same thing, these blue dots. Poorer families, wealthier families. Students from black families, poor, wealthier. They tend to do better. Pretty clear correlation between the wealth of a family, poverty, and student success. But also there's a racial component to that, right? And this is true even within individual districts. So this is a little bit more complicated. Students who are African-American or black and white students, right? Same relative economic status. Black students tend to do less well than white students. Hispanic students tend to do less well than white students in the same socioeconomic category. So there is clearly a racial component and a poverty component to educational attainment. How can we fix this? That's the big question. How can we fix this? Again, go back to this idea of federalism, that the national government has some role, state governments have some role, a lot is at the local government level. All right. Most decisions about public education are made at the state level by a number of different actors: state legislatures, governors, state boards of education, chief state school officers, state educational agencies, and at the local level by local school boards. That's where most decisions are made. Okay? So at the federal level, and I mentioned this before, the US Congress and federal law has control over some money and establishes mandates to ensure fairness or equity for all students. Okay? So that's what's done at the federal level. What's done at the state level? This is a long list. They develop curriculum guidelines and performance standards. That is how students should be doing at different grade levels. But they'll give general guidelines about what the curriculum should be. They'll provide technical assistance to help school districts and schools. They will license the schools. You have to have a license from the State Board of Education to run a public school in America. They will license or certify school teachers. They will administer the achievement tests. They will respond to accountability reporting requirements from the federal government. They will determine what's necessary for high school graduation, which can differ greatly from state to state. They will determine how the money from the federal government is spent, and they will establish the school calendar for the year. That's basically done, a lot of that is done at the state level. That seems like almost everything that happens in a middle school or high school classroom, right? What's taught, who teaches, whether the school can be a school, what do you need for graduation, and how long you're going to be going to school. Those are mostly determined at the state level, okay? So the state legislature and state law through the state educational agency then gives money to the local education agency. And in some cases, in some districts, there are separate branches here where there's an authorizer for a charter school. And again, I mentioned that a charter school is a public school, but it's different in that it runs by a special agreement with the district to do things in a slightly different way. So it has more flexibility, but it still gets some money from the federal, state, and local governments. So local school districts, I mentioned there are approximately 13,600 school districts in the United States. That's a large number. It's actually a number that's decreased. There used to be over 100,000 a long time ago. The amount of control exercised by local school districts varies by state. And some states have a lot of school districts, some states have very few. For example, Hawaii, the state of Hawaii is just one school district. But each school district is governed by a local school board. Those school board members are generally elected, but in some districts they're appointed, generally by the mayor of the city or the locality or the county. Some large school districts don't have a school board. They have what's called mayoral control. So that was true for a long time in New York City, true in some other cities. Where the local school board doesn't have authority, things are run out of the mayor's office. So that varies from place to place too. So here are the things that are done by the local school district. They determine the budget with money they get from the federal government, the state government, and local taxes. They actually hire teachers and other staff. Although teachers are certified by the state, they're hired by the locality. They set teachers' salaries. They actually implement the curriculum, although curriculum guidelines may be set by the state. Local districts determine what the curriculum will be, and they purchase things. So where does this money come from? I've talked about money several times. Again, here's this diagram that shows that there are huge disparities in the spending, right? New York State spends more than 33% of the national average. Districts in Utah and Arizona and parts of Nevada and out west and in the deep south spend much less than the federal average. Okay? Why is that true? Well, it's true because of local control. So I'll give an example. I live in Washington, D.C. District of Columbia Public Schools, the average per pupil expenditure is $19,911 per student. Okay? It's very high, much above the national average. Over here in Jefferson County, Virginia, I could drive here in an hour. It's 40 miles away. Jefferson County School District spends $7,700 versus $19,000, approximately a little bit more than a third of the expense per pupil of educating a student in Washington, D.C. is spent in Jefferson County, Virginia. How does that happen? Well, funding is mostly from state taxes and local property taxes. So places that have more expensive homes, more expensive properties, or different tax laws will collect more local taxes and be able to spend more on their schools. States provide nearly half of the public school funding. A little bit less than half is provided by local revenue, and the federal government pays for only about 8% of the cost of educating American students. And again, that comes from the constitutional role that I mentioned at the very beginning. The Constitution gives very little role to the federal government for education. And at the federal level, that amount that's spent is only 2% of what's called discretionary funding. So there's mandatory funding, Social Security, and other things that we aren't determined year to year except as entitlements. But of discretionary funding, right? A huge part of it goes to defense funding. This is mandatory funding. Okay. This is discretionary education funding, only about 2% of the federal budget. And in the past few years, that funding has gone down, right? This tends to happen. Republican president, Democratic president, Republican president, Democratic president, Republican president. More spending, less spending, less spending, less spending. All right, so it can vary. Makes it hard for school districts to plan. All right, so this goes back to the question of equity. We know that funding is determined locally and at the state level. Should students who need more receive more? Well, I would argue yes, going back to this graph, right? Students from more wealthier families do better. Students from poorer families do worse in general, in terms of academic achievement. The percentage of children who live in poverty, right, tends to be very closely correlated with race. So total about 19% live in poverty. That's much higher for Blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans. So it seems like those groups would need more funding, all right? But again, because this is done at the state level, a lot of it is done at the state level. Some states are very progressive in terms of how they spend their money, right? Progressive means they're more likely to spend their money in an equitable fashion. Regressive means they're less likely to spend their money in an equitable fashion. So for example, Utah, which has very high test results, very high graduation rates, right, tends to spend more money. Illinois spends, is very regressive in its spending. And again, that varies state to state. It's determined at the state level. So because the federal government spends such a small proportion, how should it leverage its funding? Well, one thing that people think about is, what do countries that do better than us do, right? They make education a priority. They believe that all students can learn and achieve. Students from poor families aren't doing less well because they can't do better. It's because they're not given opportunities to do well. It's because of inequities. What do those inequities due to? One of the things that we know makes a huge difference is having high quality, high performing, qualified teachers, high quality teachers. This is something that when I worked for Senator and President Obama, we spent a lot of time on, thinking about how to get better teachers. Student outcome differences are based on the effectiveness of teachers. That is, if you're a student and you have 3 years of not very good teachers, you won't do very well. If you have 3 years of very good teachers, you'll do much better. That makes sense. That's not a surprising statistic or a surprising figure, right? Now, who tends to get teachers that do well? Here's different grade levels, test results, low poverty, high poverty, low poverty, teachers that are effective by however that's measured, and measuring it is relatively complicated. Those students who go to the highest wealth schools, the lowest poverty schools, tend to have teachers that are the highest performing, most effective. Those students who go to schools that are higher poverty tend to have teachers that are less effective. Okay? Those students that need good teachers the most are least likely to have a good teacher 3 years in a row. Now, I mentioned that the federal role is relatively small, but the federal role is also relatively recent. Before the 1950s, the federal government had essentially no role in K-12 education, right? But then there was a Supreme Court decision, which is quite famous. The rule of the law of the land before that was Plessy versus Ferguson, which said that schools could be separate but equal. Facilities could be separate but equal, right? In 1954, the High Court banned school segregation in a 9-0 decision, very famous decision, Brown versus Board of Education. And this was based upon the 14th Amendment, that we cannot deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And the Supreme Court at the time decided that we conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Okay? Very important decision. Before 1954, this is what America looked like. It was actually required in the South that schools be segregated. All of these states in red required that schools be segregated, that Black students and white students could not attend the same schools. And so for centuries of public education, Black students and white students were treated unequally, right? States largely in the Northeast and Midwest, segregation was prohibited, right? Some states it was limited. Some states it was entirely up to school districts whether their schools would be segregated or not. But in 1954, segregation became illegal by a 9-0 decision, right? And this was supposed to be solved or addressed with all deliberate speed, according to the Supreme Court. Well, we know that that didn't happen. For many years, there was still segregation. President Eisenhower sent troops into Arkansas to help segregation at a school. These pictures from that time, early civil rights era, are quite famous. So in 1954, this decision was handed down. It's not until 1960 that Ruby Bridges became the first African-American child to attend an all-white school in the South. All right. There were court orders. Ronald Reagan in 1982 decided to slash funding for desegregation. Okay. In 1988, school integration was at its highest point, and it has gone down since then. In 1992, school districts were released from federal oversight. What's happened is that Black children are more likely still to be in schools that are segregated. They are more likely to be in schools that are high poverty, that have a high share of students of color. Right? White students are much less likely to be in high poverty schools with students of color. Black students are much more likely to be in schools that are both high poverty and largely segregated. And that makes a difference. If you're in a school that is low poverty and mostly white, you'll do much better for Black students on average than a school that is high poverty and mostly students of color. These are test results from those two different groups. So we're still inequitable, and that still has consequences. Right? Studies show that placing students who were from relatively poor schools and poor districts into mixed income schools, they do much better. It's the environment, right? So how does the federal government address this? Basically through two bills. One's called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or ESEA, which was launched under President Lyndon Johnson in 1965. Has had many iterations. It was enacted again in 1965, was passed with great bipartisan support. It was part of President Johnson's war on poverty to close skill gaps among disadvantaged children. Okay? The policy of the United States to provide financial assistance to local education agencies serving areas with concentrations of students from low-income families. So the federal government at that point, because of ESEA, said that it was going to spend more money to help students from poorer schools. It's gone through many iterations. 1965, ESEA was first passed, had a version called No Child Left Behind in 2001. Then when I was working at the White House, we worked, this happened after I left, to reauthorize that as the Every Student Succeeds Act. For 14 years, we couldn't agree on what that law should look like. Over this time span, the law went from 32 pages to over 1,000 pages. Okay? Much more complicated. All right. Within ESEA, Title I is the main funding source. Most of this money goes by formula to states. By formula, what that means is that the money goes to states on the basis of how many poor children they have. And those funds reach approximately 15 million students. Of the 50 million students in K-12 education, about 15 million benefit from it. Most of those are in elementary and middle schools. The level of funding has gone up significantly over the years for ESEA. This shows the level of federal funding. Okay. In constant 2017 dollars, it's gone from about $8 billion to about $15 billion most recently. And so this slide shows concentrations of poverty. This is the percentage of low-income students in US public schools, all right? So more poor students in the South and these regions of the West. Relatively higher income in places like Wyoming and North Dakota and the Northeast. This next slide depends upon understanding that. So Vermont, which has a very low percentage of low-income students, actually has this is the actual Title I funding per eligible child. So Vermont, which has very few low-income students, gets a lot of money per kid from Title I. Mississippi, New Mexico, lots of Black students, lots of Native students, which have a very high poverty level, get much less per student from Title I because of the funding formula. A lot of people think that that needs to be changed, but it's very difficult to change. So these federal laws, No Child Left Behind, and its current version of ESEA, talk about lots of different things. How teachers should be evaluated, how testing should be run, how standards should be proposed how schools should be held accountable for that. And those have changed a lot over time. Now, have these laws made much of a difference? The best evidence is that the high school graduation rate has gone up significantly, right? So this is after ESEA, but here's No Child, which all of a sudden imposed a lot of accountability for schools, defining what it meant to do well and encouraging schools to make sure that students graduated. That made a huge difference in terms from a little over 70% to over 85% of students graduating high school. That's a good thing. Had a positive effect. And most of that effect has been for students who are Hispanic, Black, or Asian Pacific Islanders. Those are considered minority, underrepresented and underserved groups in America. There's a second law called IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And this is a law that was originally passed after ESEA. And it requires special education services to students with disabilities who need such services. All of those students have what's called an individualized education plan. This is maybe the closest thing we have to a law about equity in the United States, that there has to be a plan for each student who has something that's defined as a disability. It could be a learning disability, a physical impairment, speech or language. They could be deaf and blind, autistic. All of those students may have an individualized education plan under the law, okay? It requires that all students have what's called a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. They can't be segregated into classes with all of the other students who have individualized education plans. They have to be in the regular classroom as much as possible, right? This can require a lot from teachers, right? Reducing seating instructions, breaking down assignments. As a teacher, I would spend a lot of time, and my friends who are teachers have then spent a lot of time coming up with individual practices to deal with different students who were being treated with individual education plans. The promise when this law was passed was that the federal government would pick up 40% of the cost of that, okay? In fact, the federal government is paying only about 16% of the cost. A lot of people say that this is what's called an unfunded mandate. We're requiring states and districts to do something, but not paying them the money they need. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the approach of recent presidents. I'll start with President Obama. We had a program called Race to the Top, which was considered controversial because it was competitive funding. We said we will give out $4.5 billion in competitive funding if states are willing to do four things. They're going to have tough standards. They're going to have ways of attracting and retaining good teachers and determining what an effective teacher is. They're going to use data a lot more, and they're going to turn around schools that are failing. They're going to identify schools that are really struggling, okay? So of the 50 states, I believe that 46 states applied and agreed to change their laws to address those issues. This was pretty clever because we only had enough money for much less than 46 states. We were only able to pay 13 states. But we got a lot of states to change their law. Of course, that made people mad because it seemed like a bait and switch. We were saying, here's money if you do these things. A lot of states agreed to do the things, and then they didn't get the money. After the Obama years, President Trump appointed Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos, who had a very different view of education. I'm not sure she agreed with those three things that I mentioned in the beginning. She was criticized pretty harshly. So here's a harsh criticism. Betsy DeVos, the billionaire Republican destroying public education. So what does that mean? She believed that individual liberty and school choice should drive accountability. That is, that parents could decide where their kids should go to school. We should have lots of schools within the public school system, lots of ways for students to get vouchers to take their money to go to a private school, all right? And she made a lot of changes that have been controversial. She de-emphasized the federal role in oversight and how the money was spent. She eliminated a lot of protections, for example, protections that were put in place during the Obama years about student discipline. And student discipline is often directed towards students of color disproportionately. She weakened the accountability standards that were required under the law, allowing states to have plans that didn't really fulfill what a lot of people thought they needed to do. Okay? So again, what does the federal government do in K-12 education? It spends money, mostly through Title I and IDA, and it works to ensure fairness, generally through mandates that focus on requiring equity in education. Those can be laws and those can be regulations. All right? Most of those laws are contained either within ESEA or IDA or in the Brown versus Board of Education ruling. The Biden plan. So it's too early in his administration to see what's going to happen. Here was the plan from his campaign materials. Support our educators by giving them the pay and dignity they deserve. This is a challenge and something we discussed in the Obama years because the federal government doesn't pay teachers. State and local governments do. Invest in resources, ensure that no child's future is determined by their zip code, parents' income, race, or disability. That goes to the idea of equity, right? Right. Every middle and high school student, a path to a successful career. Well, these are big goals, right? But in fact, the biggest challenge now for American schools is that shutting schools has hit everybody, but particularly poor students. And again, this is a case of inequity. So there's not much evidence on this point, but here's some. These are reading and math scores in different grade levels for the fall of 2019 and the fall of 2020, pre-pandemic and the middle of the pandemic. And each grade level, the math scores have gone down significantly. There's good evidence that math teachers have more of an effect on student learning than reading teachers. And I don't want to get into that, but the fact that students didn't have math teachers affected their math performance. Well, why is that? We were asking students to work online in most schools in America, right? And here's some data from a particular online provider for math instruction. It showed that high-income students were much more likely to be able to access and to use online resources than low-income students. So it's not surprising that student performance changed. Again, this is an example of inequity. This is inequity as a result of the pandemic, right? Some schools are open and some schools are closed. That's a decision that's made by the state. So for example, the states of Texas, Arkansas, Iowa, and Florida have forced their schools to reopen, right? Some states have their schools partially closed, California, New Mexico, a number of other states, all right? Some schools have ordered some grades. Some states have done nothing. They've left it up to individual districts. So again, this shows the patchiness of American education. All right. President Biden has come up with a plan for reopening schools. It's been very controversial because teachers, and I have lots of teacher friends who are concerned about going back to schools while the pandemic is still raging. And this has been in many cities and in districts a topic of a lot of controversy, but is the major issue. But the major issue, again, is going back to what is it that the federal government's role is and what should President Biden do? Here is an agenda from a policy think tank, applying an explicit racial equity lens to policy development. I think that's very important and something that progressives really want. Because if President Biden is going to address this idea that ensuring that every child's future is determined by their not determined by their zip code, parents' income, race, or disability, that's the great challenge of American education, ensuring equity for all students. So thank you. That's what I have to say about American public education policy.
Well, thank you, Dr. Steve Robinson. I think you've given us a very comprehensive overview of the entire American education system. I think sitting in India, even though we do make comparisons with the West, and by saying West, I mean UK and US generally, but I think this kind of statistical analysis is something that was beyond what is discussed generally. So, I mean, I could think of multiple points of intervention, where I could ask you lots of questions, and you've focused on the the monetary aspects and the aspect of fairness, where being the two primary points of intervention on part of federal government. Now, I think when it comes to questions, I think I can divide the questions on, in two categories, where we can, one, simply talk about the American experience and American education system, and also, and sitting in India, maybe we could try, the second set of category could be that we try and compare it with what's happening in India. So there are a few questions that I would also like to ask you, a few questions from the participants. Now, firstly, you mentioned how there is a difference between the Democrats and the Republicans when it comes to not just funding, but also other forms of federal intervention. But there's also a sense that there's not much of an ideological difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. Especially when Obama became president in 2008. The whole economic crisis at the time. I mean, he ended up giving the bailout packages when the expectation was that there will be some kind of radical changes in the way the economy operates. So, given the larger similarities both on the Republican and Democratic side, how deep is this difference between the commitment to education and especially education till the 12th standard, K-12 education? How really, what, I mean, is the distinction or is the difference very significant, or is it something which is maybe at a very superficial level?
I think the biggest difference is a major philosophical difference between traditional Republicans and traditional Democrats. And that is just what is the role of the federal, how big is the role of the federal government? So I mentioned that education funding at the federal level generally goes down under Republican presidents. But I think the larger issue is how is that funding spent and how much flexibility is given to states. Republicans would argue that the federal government, if they give away money, it should be money without many strings attached, without many requirements, without much accountability. It should be up to the states and local districts what they do with that money. Democrats in general believe that if states and districts have a totally free hand in how they spend the money, there's less trust that that money will be spent to address issues of equity. All right. So that's a major point of disagreement. What's the role of the federal government and how much does it get to determine how the money that it gives is spent? Because it's less than 10%, states and districts say, you really don't have much say in how we spend the rest of our money, the 90%. We should be able to do it however we want, right? Now, in fact, when President Bush was president, No Child Left Behind was passed, he took a stand that said the federal government does have a role because states have been doing this inequitably, and we have to address that. Okay. A couple of really big issues when I was working for Obama. One was what should the expectations be at different grade levels? And we worked hard with Race to the Top to encourage states to adopt what was called the Common Core, which was a group of standards that have been developed by states and educators over a long period of time and by research, saying that if you want to apply for Race to the Top, you have to have standards that look kind of like the Common Core. That is, students at this grade level should be able to accomplish this grade level. It was progressive. Because before that, if every state set their own standards, they could set their standards very low, and then all of their students would look great. They were all meeting the standards, right? So the argument was that students in Mississippi were achieving at a very different level than students in Massachusetts, because Massachusetts had a much higher level of standards. Well, when we tried to do that, the Common Core started being called Obama Core. There was a huge pushback from the right against federal education, saying we were forcing curriculum on teachers. We weren't. We were saying, here's standards that we think you should use, and if you choose to do it, we will reward you with extra money. So that whole idea of competitive grant funding was a big challenge. So I think those are maybe the two biggest differences. You know, it's really a question of what is the role of the federal government, given that it spends less than 10% in terms of holding schools, districts, and states accountable for student performance.
Thank you. Well, you mentioned, you haven't spoken much about higher education, but I think sitting in India, higher education in US something which is understood as very much desirable. And you kind of mentioned this contrasting approach, whereas it can be said from your presentation that the federal funding and funding from state resources is increasing in lower education. But that does not seem to be happening in higher education, and that is kind of leading to more inequity, inequality, and also, I mean, if we contrast it with India, I think in India both public funding in school, at school level and at graduation level, at higher education level, is significantly reducing, I would say. So do you think that this less participation, I mean, where do you stand on this role of federal funding and state funding generally? Because do you think it leads to more inclusivity, it leads to more diversity, or do you think otherwise?
Okay, so the role of federal funding at colleges and universities is mostly through what are called Pell Grants to low-income students, right? So basically, those are what we refuse to do in K-12 is give money to students and families to go to different schools. But that's exactly what's done at the higher education level. We give money to students from low-income families to attend whatever college they want to, okay? The biggest change in American higher education in my lifetime, when I was young, many, many years ago, it was possible to go to a state university and pay almost nothing. And state universities were excellent. You could go to University of Illinois, where I grew up, or University of Wisconsin, and basically your costs were negligible. Because of largely since the time of Ronald Reagan, decreases in the belief that government did good, in my opinion, saying that we need to cut taxes and give money back to people, state funding for education for colleges has decreased dramatically. So now to go to a state college is incredibly expensive. To get the same education, to go to University of Illinois or University of Wisconsin, any state school is very expensive now. That's the biggest change. And that's not a federal issue as much as a state issue. So, the question is, what do we do now that students have such high student debt? Students will graduate with $100,000 in student debt, right? That's really hard to pay for over time. And that's a huge question for the Biden administration is, what will they do about forgiving student debt? That's a big controversy right now. But again, the federal role, colleges really don't accept any or very little input into what they should be teaching or how they should be teaching. So the federal government really has no role in accountability there. Just never has.
Okay. Well, your talk has generated a lot of interest, and there are quite a few questions that are lined up. I don't know how many of them I'll be able to take, but I will take one or two of them. So this question is by a colleague here at the Institute of Law, Nirma University. His name is Pranav Saraswat. He's asking, billions of people from countries like India and China are striving hard to out-educate Americans in mathematics and technology. President Obama has said, while stressing on education reforms to prepare Americans for a global economy where jobs can go anywhere. 8 years down the line of this debate, where do you find American education system in this context now?
All right, so let me express my bias. I was trained as a scientist and was a science teacher. I worked largely on science, technology, engineering, and math education, on STEM education in America. If you're looking for a job as a teacher in the United States, if you teach science or math, you can get a job basically anywhere, because there's always a shortage of those teachers. Because people with those degrees can get a fair number of other jobs relatively easily. They're in high demand, right? We tried during the Obama administration to have incentives for science and math teaching, right? That was incredibly controversial. To have many of the teachers in America work in situations where they're part of a union. And unions really push back against differentiating pay for teachers in different subject areas or teachers of different levels of quality, or performance, however that may be defined, right? So while I think there's a general belief that when we talk about future jobs, most of those will be enhanced by understanding STEM issues, and I think specifically computer science is a huge issue. President Obama was very active in that field and trying to advance computer science. I don't know that certainly I don't think was as big a priority under the Trump administration. I don't know how big a priority it will be under Biden, because there's a lot of pushback about differentiating teachers within the United States in terms of incentives and pay and promotions. I don't know if that's an answer, but if not, ask me some more.
Okay. Well, the next question is by one of the participants, Safia. She's asking, how would you better target federal education funds to students in schools with the greatest need, especially for international students who come from different parts of the world? There are very less funding for international students who come to the US to continue their education, and there is no way that they get that money. Why the United States give federal loan to only citizens and not international students?
That's a very political question, Sophia. I think that there are so many issues about immigration and especially during the Trump years, that was such a hot button topic. Anything about people from outside the United States, people who weren't American, getting American resources was just such a political issue. So I think that's just a political dynamite. I think it's a political hot topic. As long as we can make the argument that American students aren't getting the resources they need, it's harder to make the argument that students who come to America should get more resources. I just think that politically that's a challenge. Now, to the question about equitable funding in the United States, I think there's lots of questions about how the federal education laws, particularly ESEA and its variations, how much the federal government can enforce the spending that's required, that's given under Title I. How do we focus it on high-need schools? Because we actually give a lot of flexibility to states and districts to do that. And we believe that a lot of states and districts are using money that they should use for needy students on other things. And there's a provision called supplement, not supplant. The money that's given under Title I is supposed to be used to supplement the expenses of educating students as opposed to paying for other things that all students get. And how that money is tracked and how states and schools are held accountable for it is a topic for regulation, and there's lots of activity and debate about that. But I think the foreign student issue is a totally different issue about how American politics deals with people who aren't Native Americans, who aren't born in America. I mean, Native Americans are horribly mistreated. Sorry, Sophia.
Well, I will take one last question. This is by a faculty colleague, Sukrit Garg. He's asking, it is generally considered that education must be kept free from political influence, but doing that might deprive the process of education policy formation of a participative and discursive basis. How do we ensure public input and appreciation of the same in the policy formulation process without it getting colored in any particular side's favor?
That's a really good question, and I think the answer is you can't. I just think it's going to be political because it's a question of there's never enough money, there's never enough resources. So what we're asking for, and I think what fairness demands, is to redistribute some resources within the United States. And redistributing resources means that those people who have to give up something to those people who don't have. And that's the whole question of law and politics. How do you do that? How do you get people who have enough to give up something for people who need more? That's the question of equity. And I think that's always a political question, because you're talking about redistributing or fairly distributing resources. That's what politics is. Debate over how money is spent, basically.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Steve Robinson, for such an engaging session. I wish we could go on and ask a few more questions that have been sent to me in the chat box. But thanks a lot once again. I think your presentation was very informative. I think there's a lot of stuff that we learned for sure today that we were not aware of. And now I would like to invite Tejaswi. She is one of our students here at the Institute of Law to deliver the vote of thanks.
Good evening, everyone. I, Tejaswi Jad, on behalf of Institute of Law, Nirma University, would like to thank Mr. Steve Robinson for making an excellent presentation and making this seminar very meaningful and interesting. I would also like to express my sincere gratitude towards Madam Puri Pokhriyal for her presence in this seminar. I would also like to thank Kushal Nandwani sir for moderating this session, along with other faculty members for their moral guidance and support. Thank you, sir. It was an enriching experience for all of us.
Thank you, Dr. Steve. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Looking forward to have you on campus soon next year.
Oh, I'm looking forward to that too. So.
Yes, for a longer duration. We wish you can be with us for a semester, for 3 or 4 months. It would be really great.
Okay. I think we can probably work something out.
Yes. Thank you so much. Okay. Have a great day. Okay. Bye-bye.